This is Cuba, a tropical paradise just 90 miles from American shores, so close you could almost swim there. Yet the average Cuban earns less than $30 a month. Food shortages are common, electricity is unreliable, essential medicines often unavailable. How did a Caribbean island with rich soil, natural resources, and a highly educated population end up so desperately poor? For over 60 years, the United States has maintained what Cubans call El Bloqueo, the blockade. It's the longest-running embargo in modern history, and its effects have been devastating. But why? Why has the most powerful nation on Earth spent decades systematically isolating a small island nation? And maybe, more importantly, who benefits? Today, we're diving into one of the most enduring conflicts in American foreign policy, the real reason America keeps Cuba poor. Cuba wasn't always at odds with the United States. In fact, for nearly 4 centuries, after Columbus first landed there in 1492, Cuba was a Spanish colony. The Spanish established control over the island, exploiting its fertile land and strategic location. For hundreds of years, the island's economy revolved around forced labor, native people and African slaves producing sugarcane, tobacco, and coffee for European markets. By the late 1800s, as slavery was ending globally, the United States began eyeing Cuba with huge interest. The island had a position of strategic importance, a central location in the Caribbean that could protect vital shipping lanes. After a brief but violent war between the United States and Spain in 1898, Spain ceded control of Cuba, along with Guam and the Philippines, to the United States, expanding America's empire. But unlike the Philippines, which eventually gained independence, Cuba remained under American control, and under American influence, the U.S. quickly established a government, and more importantly, implemented federal U.S. laws on the island. These laws severely limited Cuban autonomy and allowed America to impose trade and tax policies favorable to American interests, but often detrimental to Cuba's economic growth. From the beginning, it was clear that Cuba would be used to service American needs rather than to operate in its own interests. Now, if you're looking for the perfect place to grow sugar, Cuba's it. The island's warm climate, abundant rainfall, and rich soil made it an agricultural paradise, and Cubans had been perfecting sugar cultivation for centuries. For American businesses eyeing profits, Cuban sugar was a gold mine, way cheaper to produce than growing it back home. So, what happened? American companies swooped in, buying up massive tracts of land and gradually reshaping Cuba's entire economy around a single crop. Cuba had become a sugar factory for America, forced to import practically everything else it needed to survive. And talk about dependency, the US was buying a staggering 82% of all Cuban sugar, giving America enormous economic leverage over the island. This sugar-dominated relationship continued well into the 20th century, reaching its peak during the Batista era of the 1950s. Fulgencio Batista, there's a character for you. The US government loved him. He kept the sugar flowing, welcomed American businesses with open arms, and fought against anything that smelled like communism, although that didn't last long and was eventually replaced by the communist Cuba we all know. But wait, the communist Cuba? Didn't we just say that Cuba was capitalistically aligned with the US? What happened? So, here's the thing about Batista's Cuba that American tourists sipping daiquiris in Havana rarely saw. Despite all that sugar money, most Cubans lived in brutal poverty. While wealthy elites and foreign businesses thrived, ordinary Cubans suffered through growing inequality, unchecked corruption, and brutal political repression. The gap between the haves and the have-nots was widening by the day, creating the perfect conditions for revolution or communism to take root. Enter Fidel Castro, a lawyer and activist who led an armed revolt against Batista. After several years of guerrilla warfare, Castro's forces triumphed, and on January 1st, 1959, Batista fled the country. Castro took power, initially presenting himself as a democratic reformer. The United States recognized him as the new Cuban government, and initially relations weren't openly hostile. However, that changed very quickly. Within 2 years, the US had broken diplomatic ties with Cuba because of Castro's communist regime and his close relationship with the Soviet Union, America's Cold War enemy. In April 1960, the US Department of State issued a memorandum acknowledging the majority support within Cuba for the Castro administration and the rapid spread of communism. This memo stated something remarkable, that the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. In other words, the US explicitly planned to make Cubans suffer economically to turn them against their own government. The memo recommended a policy that would be adroit and inconspicuous as possible, while aiming to deny money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. This is where things really started heating up. By mid-1960, Castro was shopping for weapons from the Soviets because of the US arms embargo. America wasn't happy about this, not one bit, so they slashed Cuba's sugar quota. What did the Soviets do? They stepped right in and said, "Don't worry, we'll buy your sugar instead." See how the Cold War chess game was taking shape? Then came the oil crisis. The Eisenhower administration cut off oil exports to Cuba, forcing the island to rely on Soviet crude. But when American oil companies in Cuba refused to process this Soviet oil, Castro didn't hesitate. He nationalized those refineries all over the country. The US retaliated by canceling all remaining sugar purchases, and the economic battle lines were drawn. By October 1960, Eisenhower had seen enough. He slapped Cuba with a partial trade embargo, cutting off everything except food and medicine. Castro's response? He nationalized every American business on the island: hotels, casinos, factories, utilities, seizing them all in one sweeping move. The diplomatic relationship was on life support, and in January 1961, Eisenhower pulled the plug by severing all diplomatic ties with Cuba. The old Trading with the Enemy Act from 1917 kept the partial embargo in place. Things got worse in 1961 with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, which only strengthened Castro. He declared Cuba a socialist state and aligned more closely with the USSR. The US responded with a full trade embargo, which escalated after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Over time, the embargo tightened, especially with Reagan's terrorism designation and the Helms-Burton Act in 1996, which made lifting sanctions nearly impossible without Congress. Obama eased tensions, reopened embassies, and boosted travel and trade. For a moment, Havana was buzzing with hope, but Trump reversed it all, restoring restrictions and putting Cuba back on the terrorism list. So, that's the story of this complicated relationship, but who really suffers in the end? Well, the UN estimates that this 6-decade embargo has cost Cuba trillions of dollars. Yes, trillions with a T. The Cuban government puts the figure at $933 billion, while just the damage from 2022 to 2023 alone topped nearly $5 billion. For a small island economy, these are devastating blows. But forget the economics for a minute. What does this really mean for ordinary Cubans trying to live their lives? It means parents struggling to find medicine for sick children. It means doctors performing surgeries without proper equipment. It means empty pharmacy shelves and food rationing that's become a permanent way of life. So, why has this policy, one that clearly hasn't toppled the Cuban government, stuck around for over 60 years? A lot of it comes down to Florida politics. Older Cuban Americans, many of whom fled Castro, have long opposed any softening towards Cuba. And since Florida is a key swing state, politicians haven't wanted to rock the boat. But that's changing. Younger Cuban Americans are more open to engagement, and polls show support for normalizing relations is growing. In the meantime, the embargo has mostly hurt regular Cubans, not the government, and it's cost US businesses billions in lost trade. So really, no one's winning here. Maybe it's a matter of ego, or just a stubborn effort to keep communism as far away from the States as possible. So, what do you think? Is America keeping Cuba poor on purpose justified, or is it time for America to normalize relations and stop the embargo of Cuba? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this video interesting, like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. Virginia and West Virginia, two states sharing a name and a border, but that's about where the similarities end these days.
All but 8 West Virginia counties now declining in population.
The state's population is on the decline, faster in fact than any other state in the nation.
The number of people living in West Virginia is still on the decline.